Our next speaker is taking us on a bit of a tangent. Dr. Matino Melerba is a fellow at Deakin University's Blue Carbon Lab, and he's studying the emissions of greenhouse gas from human-made water bodies, particularly farm dams. He leads an interdisciplinary team that looks at management strategies and incentives for greener pasture practices. So I'll hand over to Martina to let us learn more about that. Thank you.
Hello? Yep, cool, great. Hi everyone, great to be here. So let me start about telling you a bit more about farm dams and why we study it. So, well, we all know what farm dams are. They are artificial water bodies, small, but they are created mostly to support agriculture. Now, there are a lot of them. Until recently, we didn't even know how many farm dams we have in Australia. It was just last year that we figured out the first estimates of Australia-wide farm dams. We estimated there are around 1.75 million farm dams. And now, of course, farm dams are mostly for agricultural practices, but because there's so many, they also start to have quite an important role in ecology and in the environment. The problem about studying farm dams is that what does it really mean to be a farm dam? There are all sorts of shapes and forms that farm dams come into. So you talk about, like oasis-looking water bodies surrounded by lush vegetation, all the way to just like simple holes in the ground with muddy water. So when it comes to really studying farm dams, well, the management has a big aspect to it. So I'm here to say that we know remarkably little about the effect of farm dams on environment, and especially on greenhouse gas emissions. So the Blue Carbon Lab, where I'm from, by the way, I should have said it from the beginning, at Deakin University, led the very first study measuring methane emissions from farm dams worldwide. It was groundbreaking, and it was just 2018, so only a few years ago. And turns out that farm dams emit 4 times more methane than natural water bodies. Now, methane emissions from freshwater water bodies is normal. We know that all lakes, rivers, reservoirs, they all emit methane. But the key issue is that farm dams somehow emit a lot more than what we expected. And this is something just recent. We talked about the National Greenhouse Gas Inventory in Australia. Well, they don't include farm dams. That's not in their radar, because it's just so new that methane emissions from farm dams is substantial. Now, as part of this publication, we identified then one hypothetical way to reduce methane emissions from farm dams is by reducing nutrients in the water. More specifically, the relationship between nutrients in a farm dam and methane emissions seems to be non-linear, which means that in theory, by just reducing nitrate in the water by 25%, based on this relationship, could halve the total amount of methane produced from a farm dam. So this is just a hypothetical model. It wasn't really based on any evidence. So the next step that we wanted to do is to try to actually identify or provide evidence on whether actually managing a farm dam to reduce nutrients could in fact reduce methane emissions. Now, but to answer this question is not that simple, because it involves a causal relationship. And in nature, well, you need to have a certain experimental design to find evidence to answer this question. Luckily for us, we collaborated with a research group at the Australian National University called the Sustainable Farms that have invested millions of dollars to create what is pretty much a unique experimental design, where they identified hundreds of properties across Victoria, New South Wales, and for each property they organized some farm dams to be enhanced or managed and some others to remain as control. And by enhancing farm dams, what it means is, fencing it to avoid livestock walking into, increasing vegetation, installing troughs, and other things like that. So this experimental design was perfect because we could just walk in and go and visit all these farm dams, measure greenhouse gas emissions, and answer the question, does enhancing a farm dam mean reducing greenhouse gas emissions? So that's what we did. We embarked in a very long field trip where we measured methane emissions across hundreds of farm dams. And the results are, what happened? There were supposed to be two bar graphs there. They disappeared. I don't know. This is the conversion Mac to PC. So I'm gonna have to just, well, trust me on this. The arrow is true. There was a bar here and a bar there. And what this graph shows is that this is the control bar, invisible. And as you go from a control farm dams to an enhanced farm dam, you drop 25% of methane emissions. Right, sorry, but I can provide the data in another version. And unfortunately, the same thing happened with this graph. There are invisible bars. Luckily, I put the arrows on all of them, so there is evidence that I'm telling the truth. So here we are talking about the effect of enhancing a farm dam on water quality. And we found that enhanced farm dams have 17% more oxygen in the water and 37% less nitrate in the water. So the water quality is better because it's like more natural, more oxygenated and less eutrophic. So, right, so after that, I really hope this works because this is an important graph. So this is called a path analysis. It's like a fancy statistical technique where you dump all your data and you try to figure out what happens, what are the causal links driving your process. And so our hypothesis is that enhancing a farm dam should lead to less methane emissions, so a reduction in greenhouse gas or carbon footprint. Right, so yes, so we confirmed that. There was like 28% reduction overall by enhancing farm dams. But the key part of this whole experiment is that for the first time, we could answer the question of why enhancing a farm dam drops methane emissions. And this is this other part here. We found that by enhancing a farm dam, you have a reduction in nitrate and phosphate in the water and an increase in oxygen concentration. And what we found is that it's not really nitrate and phosphorus directly changing methane emissions. It's more nitrate and phosphorus that are affecting oxygen. Oxygenation in the water is the key process that leads to methane emissions. And so by reducing nitrate and phosphorus, you have an increase in oxygen, and this is the whole piece of the puzzle that drives the entire process. With more oxygen, all of a sudden, you have less methane emission. So this is quite cool because finally we could attribute a causal relationship between management and methane emission. Unfortunately, I guess like the less positive part is that this part that we know of is actually a small part compared to what we don't know of, which is this part. Somehow there is something else of enhancing a farm dam that drops methane that we cannot yet explain. It could be part of vegetation, it could be part of the soil type, I don't know, something that we couldn't measure or we didn't measure. So there is still a lot unexplained here. So there is what we know and what we don't know. Both anyway answer the question that yes, managing a farm dam does drop methane emissions. And then there are also other parts that involve the environment and like climate. So you have increasing temperature and increasing rain, increased methane emissions. That's something we really can't do anything about, and they are quite straightforward. It all makes sense. So, right, so what do we do with this model? Well, go on, back. Yeah, right, so we know more or less what happens in enhancing farm dams. So what about we try to overlap our understanding of farm dams with our maps of farm dams across Australia? What happens if, for example, we magically manage to enhance all farm dams existing in Australia? Well, this is a question that we worked with the clean energy regulators with, and we try to elaborate what it could be a scope of the opportunity of reduce the carbon footprint of agriculture just by targeting farm dams. So in this case, we submitted a method to the we submitted a method to try to encourage the government to consider establishing some kind of guidelines to attribute carbon credits for managing farm dams. And unfortunately, the science is not quite up there yet, and so they simply answered no. But we're going to try again, and hopefully eventually they're going to listen to us. But what we found is that if we do some math, and this is very early early stage math, so that it's going to change as our understanding increases. But the most interesting part of this exercise is that we estimated that if there was some kind of carbon credit associated with managing farm dams, well, on average, over a 25-year period, well, farmers at the current rate of Australian carbon credit could earn between $2,000 and $4,000 just of carbon credits. Now, it's not much over 25 years, fine. But what we argue is that here is not just managing farm dams for the carbon story. There are a lot of other co-benefits of managing farm dams, such as biodiversity, water quality, less evaporation, and so on. So, and also, recently, also there was evidence showing that better water quality in farm dams means better health in livestock. So we would argue that managing farm dams is overall a good action, ecologically, but also economically. And and here is, just to wrap it up, our long-term plan in terms of this program on farm dams. The science is still at the early stages, so there is a lot to do. And so the next thing that we are trying to launch is producing a technology that makes collecting data from farm dams cheaper. Every time, right now, we need to drive 2 people to a farm dam, and they have to spend the whole day measuring methane. So that's not very economically sustainable. So now we are producing these cheap methane sensors that we can leave. They're solar powered, and they do everything automatically. We leave them in a farm dam, and they collect 24/7 information on methane. So to me, this is the next step to increase our evidence and try to turn some heads in the government up there. After that, we want to, again, try to work with the emission reduction fund and try to really find methods that we can use to attribute carbon credits for farm dam management. This is our long-term dream. Because once this happens, then we can find an economically sustainable way to then manage farm dam that doesn't involve big investment up front, but it's something that makes sense and that can even make a return in the long term. Right, and then there are also a lot of other questions to answer. I mean, do farmers want to manage their farm dam? Is there any will to change management regime? Or we want to know more about cost-benefit analysis? Well, again, like, we haven't done solid math on that, but how much does it cost to manage a farm dam? And does it make sense when you look at all the different things, especially the non-market value of a farm dam, biodiversity and water quality in general, and so on. There's another one. Right, okay, self-sustaining strategies for financing of farm dam, that I've already said that. So, cool, skip that. Right, and with this, thank you very much for listening, and I'm ready for questions.
Thank you, Martino. It's fascinating and really exciting to think that 2 or 3 years ago you're answering some of these questions, and it'd be interesting to talk with Richard during the panel hearing about, you know, if we're not accounting for that, where it's contributing, and certainly there's significant opportunities, and we've known for a long time the benefits of clean water for livestock, but I think quantifying it is quite interesting. So thank you, and I'm sure we'll have lots of questions for you later during the panel hearing. Thank you very much.